This is Talk to Seattle. I'm your host, Jason Rigden. On this episode of the show, I'm here with Kelsey Hamlin of the Sightline Institute. How are you today?
I'm doing pretty well. How about yourself?
Doing pretty good. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So could you tell me a little bit about the mission of the Sightline Institute? Maybe what kind of problems it's trying to solve?
Yeah, so Sightline's mission is essentially creating a model of sustainability within the Pacific Northwest, or a little bit broader, all of Cascadia. And so a lot of topics kind of fall under that sustainability category. Among them are housing and urbanism, fossil fuel, strategic messaging on climate change, democracy reform, transportation and transit, and then energy. So pretty much encompassing all of those things, we have researchers trying to get the facts straight on all of those topics and then connect the right people together.
So would you kind of classify it as like a think tank, or is it more like public outreach?
No, it's definitely a think tank.
Okay. So what does a think tank actually do then?
Well, a think tank thinks a lot. It basically just has researchers constantly that are assigned on specific topics, and they pretty much just write, facts and data and discoveries every single day on their specific focus.
And so what are some of the focuses of the Sightline Institute right now?
I mean, right now, our primary focus, and I would say our audience focuses on this the most as well, is housing and urbanism. So, that is only one of the topics, though. We have multiple, and they're all running all at the same time. None of them necessarily stop. So even though we do get a lot of traction on that front, it's by no means the only thing we focus on. So along that vein, I would say fossil fuel is definitely next. And then after that, democracy reform.
Okay, but urbanism ends up having such a huge consequence to so many other things. It's kind of natural why that might be the more popular aspect of it.
I mean, I would say so. Urbanism isn't necessarily always tied to fossil fuel, though, per se. It might be with your typical utilities or something. But yeah, otherwise, like those two don't overlap a whole lot, other than, living spaces being next to the industry itself.
So you folks are mostly like researching topics and putting out papers or putting out blog posts. How does the public outreach look?
Yeah, public outreach really kind of happens behind the scenes. So we hear from and connect with a lot of multiple groups in very specific geographical areas, I would say. So, that can be our local Indigenous people here in Seattle all the way down to Portland or up in Alaska. And those, of course, vary widely depending on where you're at. And so we talk with those groups constantly. We're always hearing from them. We always provide them with statistics about, the latest project proposal or the greenhouse gas emissions that's going to come from that. We do a lot of math in that front. So we just really work on the back end and are there when people need the stats and the credibility to really make their claims. Sometimes that looks like showing up to public comment, something that looks like talking to your local officials. Sometimes the local officials themselves look to our work for information.
Okay, so it sounds like maybe providing a bit of a counterbalance to some of the more, should I say, corporate interests. Sometimes they have their own think tanks that produce their own research that might be a little dubious.
I mean, yeah, you can definitely say that. I would call them public relations. But,
okay.
Yeah, definitely on that front. That's something that we do confront on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, we had just today, I did another interview with some folks from corporate accountability, and they were just talking about just the massive amount of just junk science that's out there. It's very hard to fight against.
Oh, yeah, it always is. It always is, especially, with this current, I would say, political climate, but then just in addition, the way that the internet works, the algorithms that we're dealing with and the social media platforms that come with that.
Yes, unfortunately become like an outrage machine and just kind of reinforces what your worldview is already.
Yeah, it can definitely be that way.
So how long has the Sightline Institute been around?
We actually are coming upon, or I would say just past by a week, our 25th anniversary. So we've been around for 25 years, and it is quite some time.
Oh, fantastic. And has it always been in this form?
No. When Sightline started way smaller. It started with our founder, Alan Durning, and he started off in a closet in his house, like in the basement. And when he first started that, it was called Northwest Environment Watch. So yeah, Sightline has transformed quite a bit since that time. We've grown. At this point, we have, I would say, around 45 people kind of constantly working around us. Sometimes that includes contracted writers. And we have an office. And our name has changed, obviously.
No longer in a little basement closet somewhere off to the side.
Ideally, we're not.
So recently we had 1631 fail. I felt like that was kind of surprising. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, yeah, between our allied organizations that do a lot of environmental work, I know their experience with watching 1631 fail in the polls overnight was very, very disparaging and discouraging and shocking for some of them. Sightline had some, polling that we were let in on beforehand, and so we kind of saw it coming. But despite that, we still decided to continue putting out research on all the impacts that 1631 would have.
So what do you think have been the biggest challenges for your organization?
I would say that question varies depending on who you ask here at Sightline. In part, that's because I've only been here for 6 to 7 months. And another part, it's because some of our staff members obviously have been here since the beginning. So their perception of what the biggest obstacle has been for a Sightline over the years will just be different. Since I've been here, I would definitely say the biggest obstacle is ultimately just making sure that the people who are impacted by a lot of the topics we cover can hear and see and stumble upon our research. So it's really finding those target audiences to reach when they're the ones that are going to have to really deal with the impacts of whatever policy change is happening or whatever is being proposed by, like a liquid natural gas facility. We do a pretty good job at reaching the people that are already involved in those fronts. So we do have a very large readership base there, and it's really active and it's very helpful, and the information does definitely get out. But when it comes to reaching just everyday people that are, going about their everyday lives and working under our systems, I'm always pressed to make sure that we do better on that.
Do you think it's just because they're not going to your site or on your mailing lists, or is it the media coverage isn't happening?
I mean, I think it's a combination of multiple things. So in part, it's just making sure that we brand ourselves correctly and make our email newsletters things that people don't want to subscribe to, of course, and just making sure that everything's working correctly on the algorithm front and we're easily findable and all that jazz, which I think we do a pretty good job at. And we're always working to make better anyway. I would say that hiccup really just happens on a larger scale, a mix of trying to function under our capitalist system and working all the time to survive, having the free time to decide that you're going to show up at public comment during work hours, during the work week. If you even work a 9 to 5, that always depends. It's really just flexibility and the freedom to participate in the systems that we have, which is unfortunately the things that we also cover as a think tank. So by its nature, that will just always be a point of tension.
Do you think there's growing interest in these subjects, or are people getting more and more fatigued? It feels like there's a lot of fatigue about politics in general because of some certain people.
Those who shall not be named. I would say, I mean, polls really do show when it comes to climate change, for example, that Americans have started caring more and more about climate change. And I think that's because we are seeing firsthand the impacts of that. And that's like starting to, affect our family and our friends and ourselves firsthand. And when you have that firsthand experience, that galvanizes you to start caring about what is causing those issues for you. So climate change is definitely a political topic that people are a lot more engaged in just because of current circumstances, and then also just because of changing demographics. And that can be, anywhere from age to race to like religion. All of those are intertwined in very interesting ways that really galvanize people to, I don't know, just make a collective and start caring a little bit more. But when it comes to other things like democracy reform, which is a topic we have, that is definitely much harder to get people to care about because it is so tiring in this political climate. And it's also insanely wonky and like jargon filled. And it really, when you talk about democracy reform, it seems and feels, and honestly, it kind of is such a huge task that convincing people it's worth their time and the effort and like an insane amount of really hard work to change really huge systems, it's overwhelming. And I think that's an understandable feeling to have.
So could you tell me a little bit about your initiatives to help democracy?
Yeah, I mean, we don't necessarily push forward initiatives on that front, but we definitely have been doing a lot of research on proportional representation, which is something that's happening in Canada right now on their ballot. Really, we discuss the topic of gerrymandering a lot, which is something America should be very familiar with. And Oregon also has murmured about proportional representation a little bit. Of course, during midterms, we saw a lot of progressions around democracy in terms of just like how people vote, by mail or showing up, what the needs are or the qualifications are for being able to vote also changed in a lot of states during midterms and that one. So those were really positive outcomes, but we don't necessarily cover all of the US per se. So when we're covering proportional representation in Canada, which is really where the democracy reform front lies with us right now, we're looking at Canada and hoping that this gets through so that it can essentially have a domino effect for the rest of Cascadia. And especially in the aftermath when you can look at it and say, oh, not only did this thing happen and did it make it, which is a huge step in and of itself, but we can also show what happens in the aftermath of that. So if A, then B. And when that happens is when you start getting some of your really good arguments to convince people that might be something to model.
Yes, it does seem like some of our systems we have now for democracy in the States, I don't want to say they're failing, but they're getting towards the edge. We've seen how what used to be, I suppose, our efforts to protect the minority from the majority have kind of become weapons, and it's very unfortunate. Proportional representation projects like that would be very interesting to see how that works out.
Yeah, definitely. And it's, looking at Canada as a model, of course, isn't going to be like a puzzle piece that is also going to fit perfectly in the US. Our governmental systems are clearly very different. They have a parliament and we do not. So it, of course, won't be a perfect replica if, it reaches that point. But it is definitely one step.
But a very good model for us to look towards, that kind of see what they're doing and maybe go in their direction, hopefully.
Right. Yeah, that's the idea.
So what are your plans going forward in the future?
Yeah, so we're nearing the end of this year here at Sightline, which means we're going to start wrapping up in December and deciding what our next whole year plan is in January. So our next steps aren't quite decided yet. We're looking forward to potentially covering a new topic or two. TBD on that, so I probably won't bring up exactly what those are, but they are not topics that we cover right now, obviously. So we're doing some feeling around on that front and to decide if we're going to pursue that. Sightline is definitely going to continue its democracy reform analysis, especially after Canadians cast their ballots for that measure. So that's kind of also something that we're a little bit waiting on because we have to wait for the results, obviously. We're always going to be continuing on the fossil fuel front. That's just always going to be a point blank issue until we really switch to a ton of renewables. And fossil fuels, of course, is liquid natural gas, which is actually fracked gas most of the time, fracking, oil production, shipping across the Salish Sea. all of those very large, impactful stems from the fossil fuel industry itself. And housing and urbanism will definitely continue to be something we push for. We will absolutely be looking more towards potential policy changes in Washington state for accessory dwelling units. So there will be a lot of push on that front, I would say, for half of the year next year.
Is there anything that I should have asked you that maybe I missed?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, if nothing else, I just want to add that housing is a very sometimes abstract thing, even though it is so tangible. And we obviously, if we're lucky, go home to a home every single day. But despite that fact, for some reason, we operate in these, I don't know, we operate in these apparati, I don't know what the proper word is for that, as if they just appear. And the fact of the matter is, even if we bought land and bought a house and built it ourselves, that doesn't just happen. There's rules that allow us to do and not do very specific things. And when it comes to housing in our homes, if we're lucky, or when it comes also to those who don't have homes, all of those are constantly informed by both the history of what got us to where we are today and a lot of our housing structures and the decisions that are being made right now. And I just really wish that people would be able to grasp that more. And for Seattle specifically, it's very much a sensitive topic, both because obviously our homelessness has been growing for a decade, a number of years, to the point where we've had the most deaths this year in the homelessness population ever, at least since we've been recording it. And also sensitive because we have a lot of people getting displaced, and we have just a lot of tension on that issue itself. But because of the structures that are in place and have been in place, all the way from the 60s with redlining, which you would think would be a thing of the past, but it always has impacts in the present day, to right now with our zoning laws, really limits where people can go and really causes displacement and does cause homelessness as well. Correlated, whatever you want to call it. But single family zones are 69% of the city. And if 69% of the city isn't allowing for more room and for more people, then we're limiting our entire system. And I just wish people would be able to grasp that a little more.
So how can people get involved?
Well, I mean, it's annoying because, like I've said before, these things aren't always accessible for every type of person. But the way that people can get involved, I would say that everyone can get involved at least, is talking about these issues with your friends and family, talking about the things that impact you firsthand, the experiences you have, the stories that you can tell, because everyone has those. And it's always really interesting to me how people kind of like demote themselves on that front. So really just having those conversations is something that everyone can do. Ideally, those conversations can be informed. And if you need to be informed with those conversations, you can go to our website. But outside of that, if people are looking for more organizational work or more activism or, just getting involved in policy, you can always contact your elected officials, from the city government to county to the state. You can always research, what groups are doing what work in your areas. So Seattle has a ton, which is really, really cool. Seattle Greenways, Seattle for Everyone, Share the Cities. All of these really huge groups are connected to very specific people who are movers and shakers. And once you find those groups and you make those connections, your possibilities for what you can do are ultimately limitless, because they're just so passionate about what they do. And there's so much work going on the ground for all of these efforts. So really just kind of digging around and getting to know your city, and getting to know those who are putting in the work to make your city what it is what people can do, making those contacts, talking with them, sharing their stories.
And Sightline's got a great website and a mailing list too, a newsletter.
Yeah, we have, so because we have multiple research topics, we have newsletters for each of those topics because they are very specific and sometimes people care about one more than the other. So that is an option. We also have our research newsletters, which gives you one newsletter every month for all of our research. That's actually weekly, correction. We also have a monthly newsletter that includes all of the research and just kind of daily news picks in general for that month. So we have a lot of choices for people to pick from. And there's just a lot of data out there. There's so much data and information and research, and thankfully we have it all right here. So if people feel overwhelmed by those topics, they can always just come to us, either online or they can feel free to call me up. That's cool too.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You've been listening to Talk to Seattle, and I have been your host, Jason Rigden. If you liked this episode, would you please do me a favor and tell a friend about the show? Lots of shows beg for ratings and reviews, but the fact is most people learn about new podcasts from word of mouth. So please, don't keep the show to yourself. Tell a friend. Thank you for listening, and have